In the days before personal computers,
December 21st, 1968.
before the internet and the World Wide Web connected us to global information,
As the world listened and watched,
before smartphones connected us to one another,
Following. We hear you loud and clear, following.
before GPS guided our journeys,
the United States was undertaking the most distant voyage ever attempted by man.
before this technology was a part of everyday life, American astronauts explored new frontiers in space and on the moon.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
A half-century ago, men on board the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo space capsules talked to Earth, navigated in space and to the moon and back, and exchanged critical data with mission control. How was this accomplished 5 decades ago? By the ingenuity and dedication of a company founded in the heartland of America. The Collins Radio Company in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. The Collins Story, connecting the moon to the Earth.
Go ahead, Houston, Apollo 8.
We've got it. Apollo 8 now in lunar orbit. There's
December
a chair in this
1968.
room. This is Apollo.
Astronauts Jim Lovell, Bill Anders, and Frank Borman are the first humans to leave Earth's orbit and fly to the moon. For 20 hours, the crew of Apollo 8 orbits the lunar body, 70 miles above its surface. The historic Christmas voyage gives millions of residents of Earth our first close-up look at the gray, cratered, and mountainous moon. And, even more incredible, a view of planet Earth we had never seen
Well,
before.
Frank, my thoughts were very similar. The vast loneliness up here on the moon is awe-inspiring, and it makes you realize just what you have back there on Earth. The Earth from here is a grand oasis of the big vastness of space.
The voices of Apollo 8 astronauts and the television images transmitted to Earth are made possible by an extraordinary technological effort led by the Collins Radio Company based in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. Collins Radio was founded in 1933 by Arthur Collins, a brilliant leader in the field of radio communications. He, along with engineers and scientists at his company, engage in research of radio waves from space beginning in the late 1940s. In 1958, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, is created to advance the United States manned space program. Collins Radio plays a major role in the program. The company is first selected by McDonnell Aircraft to design and manufacture communication equipment for the one-man Mercury and two-man Gemini spacecraft. The voice of every Mercury and Gemini astronaut is heard over Collins equipment.
This is the greatest experience. It's just tremendous. Right now, I'm standing on my head, and I'm looking right down. It looks like we're coming up on the coast of California. I'm going as
With each mission, NASA advances its expertise in human flight in preparation for the greatest adventure in space. Landing a man on the moon, an astronomical body believed to have formed more than 4.5 billion years ago, not long after the Earth. NASA calls the program to land humans on the moon Apollo. It requires the development of a communication and tracking system with vastly increased capabilities compared to the Mercury and Gemini programs. North American Aviation, which later becomes North American Rockwell, is the prime contractor for the Apollo Command Module. The aerospace manufacturer selects Collins Radio to lead the development and the manufacture of equipment that will reliably transmit human voices and critical mission information to Earth from deep space. In addition to the command module contract, Collins Radio has other Apollo responsibilities. For the entire program, the company is awarded contracts for 4 critical systems, including the communication system in the command module, the signal processor for the lunar module, a closed-circuit radio intercom system for the launch complex at Cape Kennedy, and a major upgrade and expansion of the manned spaceflight tracking system used for the Mercury and Gemini programs. The skills of hundreds of Collins engineers, technicians, production, and support employees located across the country are needed for the Apollo team. Program leaders supervise and coordinate the work of Collins Radio and multiple subcontractors to meet the aggressive program deadlines. Only a few months separate the scheduled launches of the Apollo manned and unmanned missions. The decade is coming to an end. There's little time left to meet the goal set by President John Kennedy.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
The country is not just in a race against time. We're also going head-to-head with the Soviet Union to be the first to land a man on the moon. The Soviets conduct their space program in a shroud of secrecy. But at the 1967 Paris Air Show, astronauts Michael Collins and Dave Scott learned from two Soviet cosmonauts that the Russians might be preparing for a manned lunar landing. In his book, Carrying the Fire, Michael Collins recalls that the cosmonauts insist the Soviet Union is not in a race with America to be the first to land on the moon. But the cosmonauts go on to say they're undergoing helicopter training, implying that they're preparing for an imminent moon landing. In spite of the mounting schedule pressure, Collins Radio employees remained focused on getting their job done right and on schedule.
A lot of stand-up midnight meetings, and 80 hours was almost a short week for us. I mean, we were just there all the time.
The Apollo program at Collins was kind of walled off, literally, physically, from much of their other efforts. They were given their own space. There was a security consideration. Bookkeeping and procedural protocols were different. So they had kind of almost a separate little group.
For Mercury and Gemini, Collins Radio develops a separate module for each radio and data function. Each module operates on a different carrier frequency. This system architecture is too large and heavy for the highly complex Apollo spacecraft that must travel 500,000 miles to the moon and back. Collins Radio and its subcontractors, using previous work in digital data communications, in partnership with NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, create a new system architecture. The solution results in the development of the unified S-band system, which combines 5 functions: voice communication, tracking, telemetry data monitoring the health of the astronauts and the performance of the spacecraft, navigation, and television signals, all of which are transmitted by just one bidirectional channel. Sharply focused radio beams from a global network of ground antenna stations enable continuous transmission to the spacecraft as the Earth rotates. The antennas maintain contact with the moving spacecraft, while the Earth and Moon are also moving. This network is called the Manned Spaceflight Network and is linked to the Mission Control Center in Houston. The Collins-supplied network is made up of ground stations with 30-foot and 85-foot diameter parabolic dish antennas. The 30-foot antennas provide coverage while Apollo is near the Earth. The 85-foot antennas provide the high gain necessary to make the lunar connection. In order to have redundant coverage, the 85-foot antennas are placed near antennas in the Deep Space Network. They are strategically located near Goldstone, California, Canberra, Australia, and Madrid, Spain, to maintain constant communication with the moon-bound astronauts. The antenna tracking stations are augmented by United States Navy tracking ships and modified Air Force transport aircraft called Oriya. Collins Radio's pioneering work in space communication leads to the company playing a significant role in the development of what would become the Manned Spaceflight Network. In 1958, Collins installs the first deep space instrumentation facility for NASA at Goldstone, California, and later at Woomera, Australia, and Johannesburg, South Africa. Later, under contracts with NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center, the company designs, manufactures, and installs the antennas and electronic equipment at 6 data acquisition facilities. These facilities are used to collect scientific data from orbiting Earth satellites. In a comprehensive approach to the project, Collins also constructs the buildings housing the equipment and the roads. For Apollo, Collins is responsible for the addition of new 30 and 85-foot antenna sites needed for the missions. Collins systems experts from the Dallas facility install the new unified S-band equipment at these sites, on the ships, and at the 3 deep space network sites. Nearly 4,000 operators will staff the global stations during the expeditions to the moon. Collins Radio trains the operators on the new unified S-band system. In Cedar Rapids, Collins engineers lead the development and installation of the S-band equipment in the command module. Their challenge is to meet NASA's strict weight and low power requirements, as Arthur Wolfsberg explains in a television interview.
The entire communication system should be shown.
Yes, let's go ahead and show them a picture of it.
This is a picture of the entire system. In our system test laboratory, we have the electronic equivalent of a space capsule in our laboratory in Cedar Rapids, where we have run this system through a very exhaustive test to make sure it will perform up to snuff. The transmitter, the entire system weighs only about 195 pounds, and its average power consumption only about 150 watts. Everything is designed for minimum power consumption.
The astronauts frequently visit the Cedar Rapids facility to receive training on the updated communication equipment. All the astronauts from Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo who fly among the stars are celebrity stars on Earth. Americans and the entire world are captivated by this group of men. Mike Yakos was an engineer working on the Apollo program at North American Rockwell in Downey, California. He later becomes part of Collins Radio when the company merges with North American Rockwell. He remembers the telltale sign that the astronauts were at the Downey facility.
There were like maybe 20,000 employees in this complex, and everybody parked half a mile away from the buildings, except the astronauts. And the astronauts came in the front gate, and they always were driving Mustang convertibles. So whenever I'd walk outside the building and I see the Mustang convertibles right next to the simulation facility, I knew the astronauts were there. Didn't bother if they were parking in front of no parking signs and that. They cut them some slack, you know, so they're taking a lot of risks. Maybe they have their privileges.
Life magazine has exclusive access to the astronauts and their families to fill the country's appetite for an intimate look into their private lives. This brings the country together with an enormous sense of pride. Americans are also well aware the astronauts are on high-risk missions. The memory of the tragic fire that claimed the lives of 3 Apollo 1 astronauts is still fresh. Virgil Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee are sealed in a command module for a launch rehearsal test when a flash fire breaks out in the capsule. Then, months before the launch of Apollo 8, an unmanned test of the Saturn rocket designed to propel men to the moon is a near disaster. The test flight is called Apollo 6. 2 minutes after launch, thrust fluctuations cause the vehicle to bounce like a giant pogo stick, causing the command module to incur severe vibrations. Shortly after the second stage ignites, 2 of the 5 main engines stop. Still, Apollo 6 manages to climb into Earth orbit. But when flight control attempts to restart the third stage to simulate a translunar injection, the engine refuses to fire. With millions of parts making up Apollo, the risks are enormous. Collins employees are keenly aware the lives of these space explorers depend on reliable communication systems.
It was really a concern because, you know, everybody imagines you get to the moon and stuff doesn't work. Oh my gosh, you know, there's no repair station.
He definitely felt he could not make a mistake. He could not let a bad connection go or anything like that. It could be improved, or if you had to completely tear it apart to fix it, it had to be fixed.
1964, moved out to the Boston area with my family, and we visited a company out there called EBSCO, who was building a product for the Apollo program at the time for us. So I spent time there with those people and worked with their quality engineers and Mr. Peterson, Pete Peterson at the time, asked me to move to Camden, New Jersey to visit RCA. That was another module that they were building for us. So my family and I packed and moved to Camden, New Jersey. And we moved there in early 66. Went there to do my job, as they asked me.
Apollo 8 is the first test of the unified S-band system at deep space distances. It performs flawlessly, linking the astronauts 250,000 miles from the moon to the Earth. The country celebrates the historic flight. Now, only 1 year remains to land a man on the moon to achieve the president's goal. The major challenge before Collins Radio is to bring Apollo 11 live from the moon. How will the astronauts communicate from the lunar surface?
About 4.5.
Collins engineers find a solution. Communication between the command module, the lunar module, or LEM, the astronauts, and mission control requires flawless management of all voice transmissions. The audio traffic must be managed efficiently for clear and reliable communication. Collins Radio develops a signal processor assembly for the LEM to handle this critical function. The signal processor performs like an air traffic controller, managing arrivals and departures of aircraft. It receives data and audio from the various sources and distributes it to the proper destination. The unit manages all S-band and VHF transmissions, as well as the onboard intercom. When the LEM separates from the command module, it connects to mission control via S-band. When the spacecraft are on the far side of the moon, contact with mission control is not possible. Voice and data communication between the LEM and command module are maintained via VHF until the Earth comes into view again. Collins supplies the equipment that records the communication and data from the space vehicles during this time. Recorded information is downloaded to mission control from the command module when the Earth is in sight. The S-band link from the LEM to Earth contains voice, biomedical and systems telemetry data, tracking, and navigation information. The astronauts who explore the lunar surface each wear a backpack called the Portable Life Support System. It contains a VHF transceiver for communication and biomedical information, all of which goes to the LEM.
Beautiful, beautiful. Isn't that something? Magnificent flight out here. Isn't that time?
A repeater function within the Collins-supplied signal processor on board the LEM connects the VHF information to the S-band transmitter and sends it to Earth. One question remains. Is there enough bandwidth on the unified S-band to include television from the moon? NASA officials are concerned that adding television will take away from the bandwidth needed for biomedical and spacecraft systems data. Collins receives a contract to study the feasibility of including television from the moon. A moonscape and mock-up of the command module are constructed in a Cedar Rapids laboratory. Engineers use the mock-up to determine installation of communication equipment and to test television transmissions. Ted Smith was one of the craftsmen who constructed the wood replica of the command module.
We had the drawings for the Apollo capsule. The carpenter shop made the frameworks and we put it together and we covered it all with copper screening. Then we covered the outside with masonite, painted them up to look just like the Apollo capsule, only they were in halves and they were on rails so it could be taken apart.
The model and the moonscape proved valuable in helping Collins engineers in their research. In a speech in Cedar Rapids, Dr. Roger Pierce, Collins' technical director for Apollo, describes the testing process.
This particular view with the simulated backdrop was used for television studies. In the initial phases of the program, we were trying to determine how good television pictures we could get from moon to Earth by going to slow frame rates and digital techniques and analog techniques. So we used this simulated thing to get the proper lighting in a moon atmosphere, and we got some fairly good pictures simulating lunar television. The idea was that it would come down over the moon link into the national networks by means of a scan converter, and the general public would be able to see the actual landing of the astronauts on the surface of the moon.
The results of the research helped convince NASA to include television. Before Apollo 11 takes flight, NASA schedules 2 other missions to test steps necessary for a moon landing. In March 1969, Apollo 9 assesses the flightworthiness of the lunar module and the feasibility of docking and rendezvous maneuvers by performing tests in low Earth orbit. In addition, Apollo 9 is the first test of the unified S-band system, connecting the lunar module to Earth.
How does that sports car handle, Jim? Pretty nice.
The LEM proves worthy of a manned spaceflight. 2 months later, Apollo 10 is the second mission to orbit the moon, but the first to do so with a lunar module. It's a complete staging of the Apollo 11 mission without landing on the moon. The LEM descends to about 50,000 feet over the lunar surface. The Apollo 10 dress rehearsal is a success. The unified S-band system proves critical, not only in communication and telemetry data transmission, but in navigation too. Apollo 11's flight will be one of the most complex navigational problems undertaken. The challenge is equivalent to kicking a football 100 yards from a goalpost and knocking a ladybug off the crossbar.
In planning Apollo, Neil Armstrong believed the greatest challenge would not be the Saturn V rocket or even the lunar landing, but rather navigation in space. The Collins Unified S-band communication system met this challenge. The Earth, the Moon, and the spacecraft were all in complex motion, and absolutely precise navigation was required to intercept the Moon at a predicted point, enter lunar orbit, and then to return to Earth and safely re-enter the atmosphere. Their target returning to Earth from 250,000 miles was just a 15-mile wide keyhole. They had to hit it at a precise angle at precisely the right time. They're hitting the atmosphere at 25,000 miles per hour, so too steep an angle and they would probably incinerate the craft and the crew, and too shallow an approach and the ship would just skip off the atmosphere into eternal space. So Armstrong's concern was, could the spacecraft be tracked accurately from Earth, and would onboard systems give an accurate fix? The small onboard computer in Apollo just couldn't solve these navigation problems, and this had to be done in a room of computers in Houston.
The unified S-band system provides a direct connection between the computer in the spacecraft and computers on the ground through its digital telemetry link. In this way, sensors aboard the spacecraft can be monitored by mission control, and precise trajectory data can be uploaded to the spacecraft without error. Updates are also provided by voice communication, making both the voice and telemetry connections extremely critical to the safety of the astronauts. This data from mission control is based on knowing exactly where the spacecraft is at all times. The unified S-band system is depended upon for precise fixes in space, including using the advanced ranging system to determine the distance to the spacecraft to within 50 feet, employing Doppler shift to determine the vehicle's velocity, and using triangulation and antenna pointing angles to determine the spacecraft's position. Armstrong's navigation concern is resolved by the spacecraft and ground systems working together, thanks to the unified S-band link that keeps the two connected. 8 years and nearly 2 months after President Kennedy asked Americans to commit to a dream to land a man on the moon, Apollo 11 is ready for flight. The crew is made up of 3 veterans of the Gemini program. Neil Armstrong is mission commander. Michael Collins is the command module pilot. And Edwin Buzz Aldrin is the lunar module pilot. The command module is given the name Columbia. The lunar module is called Eagle. An estimated 1 million people travel from all over the country to watch the launch at Cape Kennedy. News organizations from around the world are crowded in the press box to record the historic event. On the hot and humid morning of July 16, 1969, the countdown is underway.
GRR. Ready, GRR. 10, 9, ignition sequence started. 7, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Liftoff. Roger, clock. Clock start flight, Roger. Rest to go, all engines, Roger.
At 9:32 Eastern Daylight Time, Apollo 11 roars off on the greatest space adventure yet. After 1.5 orbits around the Earth, the spacecraft rockets off on a 3-day journey to the Moon. Broadcast journalist Walter Cronkite is covering Apollo 11 for CBS News, just as he has every manned spaceflight since the early days of the Mercury program. In a story shared with Michael Collins, his father Arthur was in a meeting when he received a phone call from Cronkite.
He took the phone call, he left the room, and he came back and didn't show much emotion. I didn't make much of it. And who was on the phone, Art? That guy Cronkite from CBS. And I didn't want to talk to him because it's not about me, it's about the engineers, and I don't want to blow my own horn, and they wouldn't get proper credit. And he was asked to describe in brief detail how the Collins communication system worked, and he just passed on and said, "No, I don't think so, thanks very much," and hung up. Those who knew my dad admired him for his lack of hubris. He was not a self-promoter. He wanted to promote his company, but he wanted to keep it toned down. It would have been a golden opportunity, but it just didn't happen.
Nonetheless, millions of people on Earth are fellow travelers on this voyage, thanks in part to the brilliant engineering contributions made by the people of Collins Radio. One of those engineers was Art Roberts, manager of microwave systems. To meet Apollo 11 mission requirements, NASA determines a dish antenna larger than 85 feet in diameter would be necessary for better television reception from the Moon. A 210-foot antenna, recently installed for deep space research at Goldstone, California, is the candidate solution. However, the gigantic antenna must have a direct connection to the 85-foot antenna site at a ground tracking station several miles away. But there's a mountain between the two locations. Roberts and his team of systems engineers from Dallas devise an ingenious solution. They use Collins Radio's microwave equipment and a passive repeater on top of the mountain to connect the massive antenna to the smaller antenna site. Roberts himself climbs the microwave towers to align the antennas, communicating by two-way radio to people on the ground. The work of Roberts and his team not only provides the critical go-for-landing communication with the LEM during descent, it also enables the world to hear the historic words of Neil Armstrong as he takes the first step upon the Moon. On July 20th, day 4 of the mission, Armstrong and Aldrin make their way into the lunar module, power it up, and check the systems. Then, the astronauts undock the vehicle from the command module.
How does it look? Roger.
The first task is to establish communication between the LEM and Mission Control via the unified S-band system.
This
Eagle, we're standing by for your burner, report over.
The LEM orbits the moon at 3,000 miles per hour. A rocket burn will decelerate the spacecraft as it nears the surface. The targeted landing zone is near the Sea of Tranquility.
Altitude 4,200. Houston, you're a go for landing, over.
Among the engineers at Mission Control monitoring the lunar module landing is 24-year-old guidance officer Steve Bales. Bales is a native Iowan and a graduate of Iowa State University in aeronautical engineering. As the LEM continues its descent, a computer program alarm goes off. Mission Control must decide, should the landing be aborted? Based on a previous mission simulation, Bales determines it's safe for the LEM to continue its descent. Flight Director Gene Krantz accepts Bales' recommendation and calls for the landing to proceed.
Roger, we got you. We're going at alarm. Good radar.
Moments later, a second program alarm sounds. For a second time, Mission Control must quickly assess the situation to determine if the landing should be aborted. Bales realizes the computer is so busy, it's not able to keep up with all its tasks, and it's dropping off computing jobs. But he sees the high-priority computing tasks are still being done. Once again, Bales calls for a go for landing.
1201, roger, 1201 alarm. We're go, same time, we're go.
At about 1,000 feet, Armstrong looks out a window and realizes the LEM's computer is steering the spacecraft towards a crater filled with huge boulders. At 400 feet, Armstrong takes control, using his skills as a military test pilot to fly the spacecraft away from the boulder field to find a suitable landing spot. Mission Control notices the LEM is seconds away from running out of fuel.
60 seconds.
Armstrong searches for a suitable landing area. With 17 seconds of fuel remaining, Armstrong lands the Eagle on the moon.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. It's about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot. Tranquility, be advised there are lots of smiling faces in this room and all over the world, over.
There are two of them up here.
Roger, it was a beautiful job, you guys.
And don't forget one in the command module.
Roger.
Inside the LEM, Armstrong and Aldrin forgo a scheduled sleep period and suit up for the most incredible extravehicular activity of all time. 6 hours later,
The hatch is coming open.
Armstrong squeezes through the opening. He slowly moves down the ladder.
How am I doing? You're doing fine.
On the second step, he pulls a D-ring, deploying a television camera on the LEM.
Okay, Neil, we can see you coming down the ladder now.
An estimated 600 million people from all over the world are now watching a miraculous event. Not only has man landed on the moon, he will now walk on it. At 10:56 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, Neil Armstrong puts his left foot on the moon.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
15 minutes later, Aldrin steps down the ladder to join Armstrong.
Down about the fourth rung up. There you go.
2 Americans are walking and talking on the moon.
Here, men from the planet Earth, first set foot upon the moon, July 1969, AD. It came in peace for all mankind.
We had just built a new house, and it had an open deck on the west side. And we brought a television out on the porch and chairs, and my 3 daughters and my wife and I sat and watched that whole thing. That was a very moving moment in our lives. To watch those men on the moon and watch Neil take that step and to think we had something to do with it.
Well, it really gave you kind of a tingly feeling all over, or at least me it did, and I was really proud.
And to turn out to be successful, that was great. It's worth, called for a celebration.
My husband and I went to the Space Center this last summer, and it just blows my mind to know how everything fits together and how everything worked through those years, how brilliant those people were that put everything together. And I had just a minute part of it, and I'm very proud of that.
Armstrong and Aldrin spend nearly 2.5 hours collecting soil and rock samples and setting up experiments. On July 21st, the Eagle lifts off the moon and redocks with Columbia. Apollo 11 returns home. 3 days later, it splashes down in the Pacific Ocean. President Kennedy didn't live to see it, but Apollo 11 has achieved his dream for the country and has won the space race. In a rare interview with the Cedar Rapids Gazette reporter, Arthur Collins shares his thoughts about the momentous event. He says he was as excited as the rest of the world. Arthur notes that Collins' communication systems had been thoroughly tested. But he was still surprised and impressed with the clarity of the transmissions through the narrow band video channel. It made you feel like you were there, he tells the reporter. And as is his way, Arthur Collins didn't take any credit for himself for his company's huge accomplishment. It was the people who did it, he says. Several years later, the man who made the historic first step on the moon visits Collins Radio in Cedar Rapids. In a speech to the Collins Management Club, Neil Armstrong describes how he feels about the role he had in space exploration. And he recognizes the outstanding efforts of the people at Collins Radio who helped make it possible.
Well, I feel very fortunate not only have lived in this small wave of history that's now traveling outward in all directions from Earth, but I've been lucky enough to be a participant. And I suspect that many of you feel the same way. Those of you who worked on the Apollo communication system can be proud of the flawless performance of that equipment and the standards that Collins maintained.
The country's excitement over Apollo 11 extends to Apollo 12. In November 1969, Apollo 12 is launched. Americans cheer on the second crew to land and walk on the moon. The prowess of the United States in manned space travel is firmly established. Five months later, Apollo 13 sits on the launch pad at Cape Kennedy, stretching towards space. There's a marked difference in Americans' enthusiasm for this voyage, however. The drama of the adventure has worn off. The public's interest has waned. They expect it will be another successful moon landing. There's not even any nervous superstition over giving the mission a number 13. Jim Lovell, NASA's most experienced astronaut, a veteran of 2 Gemini flights and Apollo 8, is the mission commander. Jack Swigert is the command module pilot. And Fred Hayes is the lunar module pilot. The command module is named Odyssey, the lunar module Aquarius. On April 11, 1970, Apollo 13 lifts off for the moon.
Okay, battle has it. Looks good here, flight. Good.
55 hours after launch, the crew is ready to get some sleep. First, Mission Control makes a routine request to make a cryo stir. The procedure turns fans on inside one of the liquid oxygen tanks to get an accurate pressure reading.
13, we've got one more item for you when you get a chance. We'd like you to stir up your cryo tanks. Okay, stand by.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we've had a problem. And we had a pretty large bang associated with the caution and warning there.
Warning lights illuminate in the command module, indicating the loss of 2 of the 3 fuel cells, the spacecraft's prime source of electricity. In addition, 1 liquid oxygen tank appears to be empty, and the supply is rapidly depleting in the second tank. The astronauts in Mission Control realize the command module is dying, and all of the remaining battery power and oxygen must be preserved for re-entry. A rapid flow of information is being exchanged between the crew and Mission Control.
Go ahead, Econ. The pressure in O2 tank 1 is all the way down to 297. We better think about getting in the LEM or using the LEM systems.
The astronauts are approximately 200,000 miles away and approaching the moon. The mission has immediately changed from landing on the moon to getting the 3 men back to Earth in a crippled spacecraft. Countries around the world offer support and assistance, including the Soviet Union. In Australia, a Herculean effort readies a large radio telescope antenna to receive high-rate digital data from low-power transmitters and backup antennas on the spacecraft. Collins Radio's communication equipment in the command and lunar modules, in addition to the tracking systems on the ground, must meet the challenge of providing voice communication and critical digital data transmissions between Apollo 13 and Mission Control. NASA officials hold a press conference to share the news with the nation.
Their lives are dependent upon at the moment rather than worrying. I'd say this is as serious a situation as we have ever had in manned spaceflight. We've always called the LEM a good lifeboat under those circumstances.
The command module, with its oxygen and power rapidly depleting, is shut down. The crew moves into the LEM. The descent propulsion system of the LEM will be used to whip the spacecraft around the moon and back to Earth. The onboard computer is not programmed to accommodate the combined mass of the LEM and the command and service module. Mission Control determines 2 burns are necessary to get the astronauts home. The rocket burn data must be conveyed by voice over unified S-band from Mission Control and entered manually by the astronauts. An immediate burn of 31 seconds is needed to put the spacecraft on a life-saving re-entry trajectory. A second burn of 4 minutes and 24 seconds is required to shorten the mission by 10 hours and to ensure the spacecraft lands in the Pacific Ocean. This second burn takes place 2 hours after rounding the far side of the moon. The burns are successful. Apollo 13 is on a life-saving trajectory. The 3 men must now spend nearly 3 days in a vehicle equipped to support 2 people for 2 days. Water, food, and power are carefully rationed. The power limitation makes the Collins S-band tracking system essential when self-navigation becomes impossible. After a day and a half in the LEM, a warning light indicates carbon dioxide is building up. There are carbon dioxide scrubbers in the command module, but they're square in shape. The openings in the lunar module environmental system are round. Engineers in Mission Control work to resolve the problem using materials available on board. Their solution? A fabricated adapter using plastic bags, cardboard, a sock, and duct tape.
The first thing we want you to do, take one of these LCGs and cut off the outer bag by cutting along one of the heat seals. Do it carefully and close to the heat seal because we may have to use the outer bag if we damage the inner bag.
The makeshift adapter works and the CO2 levels come down. As Apollo 13 approaches Earth's orbit, the crew transfers to the command module. After being shut down for a couple days, it's cold and there's condensation on the walls, ceiling, and equipment panels. The astronauts wonder if the command module will power back up. The crew begins flipping switches and the equipment comes to life, including the Collins communication equipment. Collins Radio's attention to extensive testing and quality is paying off once again. The astronauts jettison the LEM that has been their lifeboat for the last 3 days.
They're well
They now face one of the most dangerous parts of their mission: re-entry. There's concern the protective heat shield on the command module might have been damaged in the explosion. Americans and the rest of the world are holding a collective breath. An estimated 40 million people are transfixed to radios and televisions, waiting to hear the fate of the astronauts. Upon re-entering the Earth's atmosphere, the command module normally experiences a loss of signal, preventing radio contact with mission control for 3 minutes.
Odyssey Houston, standing by, over.
And then, the nation hears the voice of Jack Swigert. His words are transmitted via a Collins high-frequency radio on board an Araya airplane.
It was on a Collins-built ARC 58, which is a 1 kilowatt transmitter. It was a single sideband. It was the only radio that had enough power to go from north of Guam all the way to Houston.
2 months later, NASA engineers conclude the explosion on Apollo 13 was due to an improperly specified thermostat switch in the service module, resulting in damaged wiring and failure of the stirring system. The Collins radio communication equipment in the spacecraft and on the ground provide critical, life-saving communication between the astronauts and mission control. The harrowing flight of Apollo 13 is a jarring reminder of the dangers of space exploration. While the Collins Unified S-band played a life-saving role in Apollo 13, it performs a critical function that saves the Apollo 14 mission. In just one example, astronauts Alan Shepard and Ed Mitchell are in the LEM preparing to descend when an alarm indicates a malfunction. The astronauts must reprogram the LEM's computer to override a failed switch and prevent an automatic abort of the landing. Mission Control has less than 2 hours to devise and send a software patch requiring the astronauts to manually enter program data to avoid aborting the mission. The patch is transmitted by voice over the Collins Unified S-band system.
Antares, Houston, the computer's yours.
Thank you. You troops did a nice job down there. That was beautiful.
The mission succeeds with a precise landing. The addition of the lunar rover keeps the Apollo program alive for missions 15, 16, and 17. The electric car enables the astronauts to rove several miles from their landing sites and carry much larger rock payloads. Apollo 15 brings back 170 pounds of rock samples, including the Genesis rock, believed to have existed since the time the moon was formed. The lunar rover also proves valuable when the astronauts leave the surface. The vehicle is positioned to use its camera and the S-band system to provide live television of the LEM's liftoff. Apollo 16 is also primarily a geological science mission. Astronauts John Young and Charles Duke are in continuous communication through S-band with scientists on Earth. The scientists guide the astronauts in selecting prime geological samples.
As you come around there, there's a rock in the near field on this rim that has some white on the top of it. We'd like you to pick it up as a grab sample.
This one right here?
That's it.
In December 1972, Apollo 17 carries the last humans to step onto the moon. Commander Gene Cernan is the 12th and last man to walk on the lunar surface.
99.
The Collins Unified S-band system receives the final dramatic Apollo images, live from the moon.
Right away, Houston. Vector grid.
NASA had plans for 3 more missions, but federal budget cuts forced the agency to cancel them. In 1975, the chapter of history known as the Apollo program is officially over. But the technology supplied by Collins Radio for the manned space program has a lasting impact. In 1973, a command module using Collins communication equipment ferries astronauts to Skylab, the United States' first orbiting space station. In 1975, a command module docks with the Soviet Soyuz spacecraft while both are in Earth orbit. These two endeavors become the foundation for U.S.-Soviet cooperation on the Mir space station, and later for global cooperation on the International Space Station, still in operation today. What began as an intense race to the moon between two superpowers is now a vessel for cooperation in space. The Collins built deep space network antennas, including the 210-foot dishes in Australia and Spain, continue to bring the universe to our doorstep, as they have for over 50 years. The data and images received from deep space probes are transforming our view of the cosmos. Apollo gave the world the confidence to dream. It marks the only time humans have visited another celestial body, a testament to the power of science, technology, creativity, curiosity, and man's courage. Collins' reliability was essential in getting the space explorers safely to the moon and back to Earth.
There was never a failure of Collins equipment during the entire Apollo program.
To the Collins radio family, the impact of Apollo is personal.
Ever in my life has compared to the Apollo program in general.
I was proud to be on that Apollo program,
It was a team effort, it really was.
It had also been an extraordinary journey for the founder of Collins Radio, Arthur Collins. In 1925, in an attic ham shack in his family's Cedar Rapids home, Arthur established reliable radio communication with the Macmillan Arctic Expedition. He was only 15 years old. The company he created would be on the leading edge of radio communication and navigation technology. Under his visionary leadership, Collins Radio was at the forefront of space communication research. This technology expertise led to a historic role in communications for manned spaceflight, a role that would bring the world along on an epic space voyage, live from the moon.
It is necessary that we marshal the combined powers of many scientific and engineering disciplines, together with man's other creative and spiritual faculties, in an effort to build a decent and meaningful world. Whatever your field may be, your progress will depend upon your individual imagination. I urge you to give it free rein.